The sun had just started to dip behind the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the small suburban neighborhood. In a cozy house nestled between two tall trees, a young black girl named Maya stood by the window, her gaze drifting towards the house next door. She had only moved into the neighborhood a few months ago with her family. They were new faces among many long-established families, and Maya sometimes felt a bit out of place. Her family had always taught her the importance of kindness, and it wasn't unusual for Maya to lend a helping hand when someone was in need. But she wasn't sure how to approach her elderly neighbor, Mr. Collins, who lived next door. He was a quiet man, someone who kept to himself, and Maya had often seen him sitting on his porch, his eyes distant and thoughtful, but he never waved or greeted anyone. At first, Maya thought he must be grumpy, or perhaps he didn't like visitors. But as the days went by, she noticed something that made her curious. Mr. Collins seemed to struggle more as he went about his day-to-day activities. One afternoon, Maya saw him struggling with a heavy bag of groceries, leaning heavily on his cane. His steps were slow, and he winced as he carried the bag up the steps to his porch. She felt a knot form in her stomach. She had always been taught to help others when they were struggling. But this was different. This was someone who didn't seem to want help, and Maya wasn't sure if she should intervene. But then something inside her changed. The more she watched Mr. Collins, the more she saw that he wasn't someone who would ask for help, no matter how much he needed it. He was the type of person who was proud of his independence, someone who had lived a long life and carried with him the weight of his experiences. Maya didn't know why, but in that moment, she decided to do something about it. With a deep breath, she put on her shoes and walked out the door. As she approached Mr. Collins, she felt her heart race. It was a simple thing, offering help, but it felt like a big step. She had no idea how he would react. She had only ever seen him from afar, never close enough to say more than a polite hello. But she knew she had to try. "Excuse me, Mr. Collins," Maya called out gently, trying to sound casual. "Let me help you with that." Mr. Collins looked up at her, his weathered face softening in surprise. He stood still for a moment, unsure whether to accept the help. His eyes twinkled, as if he were debating with himself whether to allow this young girl to take over. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly, a small smile appearing on his lips. "Well, I guess I could use a hand," he said, his voice low but grateful. Maya smiled back, relieved that he had agreed. As she took the heavy grocery bag from his hands, she could feel the weight of it, and it made her realize just how much he had been carrying. Not just the groceries, but the years of living on his own, the quiet loneliness that Maya hadn't noticed before. As they walked together toward his front door, Maya felt a small connection forming, one that she knew was the beginning of something special, though she didn't know it yet. Little did she know, that small act of kindness was about to change both their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. Maya returned to Mr. Collins' house several times after that first encounter. Each visit was small, but meaningful, simple gestures that slowly built a connection between them. At first, it was just the occasional helping hand when he needed assistance with something around his house. Maya would offer to carry his groceries or help him rake leaves in the yard. Every time, Mr. Collins would hesitate, but he always accepted her offer with a kind, appreciative smile. As she spent more time with him, Maya began to notice little things about Mr. Collins. He had lived alone for years. He didn't have children, and his wife had passed away some time ago. He spoke about her with a gentle sadness in his voice, his eyes softening as he remembered the moments they had shared. There was a warmth in the way he spoke of his past, but also a quiet longing that Maya couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as she helped him carry some boxes into the house, Mr. Collins began to open up more. He told Maya about his time in the military when he was young, and how he had traveled across different countries. The stories he shared were filled with adventure and excitement, but there was a hint of melancholy in his voice. Maya could tell he missed the companionship he once had, the bustling days when his life was full of people. He had a wealth of experiences and memories, but at that moment, they seemed to weigh heavy on him. Maya listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and understanding. She could tell that Mr. Collins didn't often have someone to talk to, and it made her heart ache for him. His words weren't just about the past. They were a plea for someone to listen, for someone to acknowledge his existence beyond the quiet walls of his home. As time went on, Maya began bringing over small things to brighten his day. A bunch of fresh flowers from her garden, a warm meal, or sometimes just a small handwritten note that said, "I hope you have a good day." It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring a smile to Mr. Collins' face. He didn't expect anything in return, but he welcomed it, the small gestures that showed someone cared. One day, Maya arrived at his house with a pot of soup she had made herself. It was chilly outside, and she knew the warmth of the soup would bring comfort. When she knocked on his door, Mr. Collins answered with a bright smile, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the steaming pot in her hands. "You're too kind, Maya," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I've never had a neighbor like you before." Maya smiled, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't about the soup or the flowers. It was the connection they were building, the bond that was growing between them. Slowly but surely, they were becoming more than just neighbors. They were becoming friends. And with each passing visit, Maya realized that her simple acts of kindness were changing both of their lives. For Mr. Collins, they'd brought a sense of comfort and joy he hadn't felt in years. For Maya, they'd brought a deeper understanding of what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. It was a relationship built on trust, compassion, and the small but powerful moments that made life feel a little less lonely. Over time, Maya's visits to Mr. Collins became a regular part of her routine. It wasn't long before she found herself looking forward to those moments, whether it was helping him around the house or simply sitting with him on his porch, watching the sunset together. Mr. Collins, too, began to look forward to these moments. He would smile when he saw Maya walking up his driveway, and his eyes would light up whenever she knocked on his door. One afternoon, as Maya arrived with a basket of fruit she had picked from her garden, she noticed something different. Mr. Collins was sitting in his favorite rocking chair on the porch, but he didn't look as cheerful as usual. His shoulders were slumped, and there was a faraway look in his eyes. He didn't greet her immediately, so Maya hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Mr. Collins," Maya called softly. "Are you okay?" He turned slowly to face her, a small sigh escaping his lips. "Oh, I'm fine, Maya. Just thinking about things." Maya set the basket of fruit down on the small table beside him and took a seat. She had learned that sometimes Mr. Collins needed a little space to open up, but when he did, he trusted her with his thoughts, and she had always been ready to listen. She waited patiently, knowing that he would speak when he was ready. "It's just," Mr. Collins began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've lived here a long time, and sometimes it feels like time is just slipping away. I've had a good life, but sometimes it feels like I'm just waiting for something." Maya could hear the sadness in his voice, and her heart ached for him. She knew that loneliness was something he had been dealing with for years. Though he had never asked for help, Maya could tell that he needed someone to be there for him, someone who would listen and care. "You know," Maya said gently, "my mom always says that sometimes the best thing you can do when you're feeling down is to keep going, even when it seems hard. It doesn't mean you're alone, though. You've got people around you who care." Mr. Collins gave a small nod, though he still looked lost in thought. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, offering the comfort of her presence. They didn't need to speak any more words for a while. Sometimes just being there was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Maya and Mr. Collins began spending more time together. She would visit him on weekends, and he would share more stories about his life, his childhood, his adventures in the military, and his years of working as a mechanic. It became clear that these stories weren't just memories for him. They were his way of staying connected to the world. They gave him a sense of purpose, reminding him of the person he once was before life had slowed him down. One day, after a long conversation, Mr. Collins looked at Maya with a smile that was filled with gratitude. "You've got a good heart, Maya. I'm lucky to have you as a neighbor." Maya smiled back, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just luck. It was the bond they had built together, a bond rooted in kindness, trust, and love. She knew that their friendship was special, and she was proud of it. No matter how different their lives had been before, they had found something in each other that made them both feel whole again. From that day on, Maya's visits to Mr. Collins took on an even deeper meaning. It wasn't just about helping him with his groceries or fixing his porch railing. It was about being there for each other, sharing the little moments that made life feel worthwhile. And in the process, they both learned that sometimes the most unexpected friendships could be the ones that changed your life forever. As winter arrived, the crisp air grew colder, and the neighborhood seemed to quiet down. The leaves had fallen from the trees, and the days were getting shorter. Maya could feel the change in the air, but what worried her more was the change in Mr. Collins. She noticed that he was moving more slowly than usual, his steps heavier and more deliberate. He still sat on his porch every day, but his once bright eyes now looked more tired, and there was a noticeable droop to his shoulders. One chilly afternoon, as Maya walked down the sidewalk to his house, she noticed him standing at the foot of his steps, trying to clear the snow that had accumulated. His cane was leaning against the porch, and he was struggling to use a small shovel to move the thick snow. Maya's heart sank as she watched him. Without a second thought, she hurried up the driveway and gently touched his arm. "Mr. Collins, let me help you with that." He looked up at her with a surprised expression, but then he gave a small, grateful smile. "I've got it, Maya. It's just a little snow." But Maya could see the strain on his face, and she wasn't going to let him struggle. "You don't have to do this by yourself. I'll take care of it." With that, Maya took the shovel from his hand and started clearing the snow, her movements quick and sure. Mr. Collins stood beside her, watching silently, but she could see that he was relieved. It wasn't just the snow that was weighing on him. It was the quiet loneliness and the burden of getting older. Maya could feel it too, how he had been trying to carry on as if nothing had changed. But the truth was, things were changing, and he didn't have to face it alone. As she worked, Maya couldn't help but think about how much Mr. Collins had done for her in such a short time. He had shared his stories, his wisdom, and his kindness with her, offering her a window into a life that she might not have understood otherwise. He had become more than just a neighbor. He had become a friend, someone she could rely on just as much as he relied on her. When the last of the snow had been cleared, Maya stood up and wiped her hands on her jeans. Mr. Collins was still standing by the porch, his cane now back in hand, but he looked at her with a kind smile. "You're too good to me, Maya," he said softly. Maya shook her head, a grin spreading across her face. "No, Mr. Collins, you've done so much for me already. This is the least I can do." They stood there for a moment, the air cold but their hearts warm. Maya's actions weren't just about shoveling snow or running errands. It was about showing that she cared, that she valued the friendship they had built. And in that moment, Maya realized something important. It wasn't about grand gestures or big acts of kindness. It was the little things, the small, everyday moments, that made the biggest difference. As the weeks passed, Maya continued to check in on Mr. Collins. She would bring him soup on the coldest days, help him with his laundry, and make sure he was comfortable. Sometimes they would sit in his living room, the fireplace crackling softly, and talk about the world. He'd share stories of his past, of the places he had visited and the people he had known. Maya listened, her eyes wide with curiosity and admiration. She didn't just see an elderly man who was struggling. She saw a person with a lifetime of experiences and wisdom, someone who had so much to offer, even in his quietest moments. Though Mr. Collins never asked for help, Maya continued to give it, and with each passing day their bond grew stronger. A quiet friendship built on love, respect, and the willingness to help one another through life's struggles. As the days turned colder and winter settled in, Maya noticed her visits to Mr. Collins became even more important to him. The once bustling neighborhood was quiet, with families tucked inside their homes, and Mr. Collins seemed to be growing more reclusive with each passing day. His health had begun to decline further, and Maya could tell he was starting to feel the weight of the season, both physically and emotionally. One afternoon, Maya's mother, noticing how often her daughter was visiting Mr. Collins, sat down with her in the kitchen while she prepared dinner. "Maya," her mother began softly, "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time at Mr. Collins' place. Are you sure you're not doing too much? You've got schoolwork, too, you know." Maya looked up from stirring the soup she was making, and she smiled. "I know, Mom, but he's been lonely, and he's not doing well. He doesn't have anyone else around." Her mother paused for a moment, thinking, and then nodded slowly. "I understand, sweetheart, but I want you to make sure you're also taking care of yourself. Helping others is important, but don't forget to put yourself first sometimes." Maya's mother's words echoed in her mind as she continued to visit Mr. Collins. It wasn't that she didn't care about her own needs. It was just that spending time with him had become something more than just a helpful gesture. He had become a part of her life, a person who needed her just as much as she needed him. But her mother was right. She couldn't pour from an empty cup. It was important for her to make sure that her family was there to help too. The very next weekend, Maya's parents decided to visit Mr. Collins as a family. Her father, a kind-hearted man who enjoyed tinkering with tools, had noticed the state of Mr. Collins' front porch railing. The paint had peeled away, and the wood was starting to rot in places. Her mother had noticed Mr. Collins shivering on the porch the week before, even though he had layered up with warm clothes. Maya's parents went over to Mr. Collins' house that Saturday afternoon, and they found him sitting inside, looking out of the window at the yard. It seemed he had been waiting for something, or maybe someone. When he saw Maya's parents approach, his eyes brightened with surprise, and he stood slowly to greet them. "I didn't expect to see you all today," Mr. Collins said, his voice gentle but filled with warmth. "We just wanted to stop by and see how you're doing, Mr. Collins," Maya's father replied, offering him a friendly handshake. "We've noticed a few things around the house that could use a little attention, and we thought we'd help," Maya's mother added. "I know you're a proud man, but we want you to know we're here to support you." Maya's heart swelled with gratitude as she watched her parents speak with such care and respect for Mr. Collins. He might have hesitated at first, not wanting to seem like a burden, but after a moment of quiet reflection, he smiled and nodded. "That would be very kind of you," he said softly. "I'm not used to asking for help, but it means a lot to me." Her father, already rolling up his sleeves, headed outside to inspect the porch railing. Maya's mother sat down next to Mr. Collins, and they began chatting about the old days, swapping stories of their childhoods and life lessons. Maya could see how much this conversation meant to him. It wasn't just about fixing the house. It was about the connection between the people who cared about him. Later that afternoon, Maya joined her parents outside. Her father had finished fixing the railing, and it looked as good as new. Maya had taken the opportunity to shovel Mr. Collins' walkway once more, ensuring that no snow or ice would get in the way of his steps. Mr. Collins stood by, watching the work with a quiet appreciation, but Maya could see that he was more than just grateful for the work being done. He was grateful for the effort, the time, and the love that was being poured into his life. Maya's family didn't just fix his porch, they fixed something deeper within him. It was a reminder that even when life feels isolating, there are people who are there, ready to help, even when it's difficult to ask. That day, when Maya and her family left Mr. Collins' house, it was clear that a new chapter had begun. Maya wasn't just a young girl visiting an elderly neighbor anymore. She was part of a bigger circle, a circle of family, love, and support that extended beyond bloodlines and reached across generations. Together, they were more than neighbors. They were a community, and they had built something lasting and beautiful, one small act of kindness at a time. The winter seemed to drag on longer than expected, with cold winds sweeping through the neighborhood and the first snowstorm of the season, leaving a thick blanket of snow on the ground. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Maya noticed that Mr. Collins' health seemed to be getting worse. He had been a bit slower, more tired, and it wasn't just the winter that weighed him down. It was clear to Maya that something wasn't quite right. One evening, as she knocked on his door to bring him a warm batch of homemade muffins, she was met with silence. Her heart skipped a beat. Mr. Collins always greeted her with a smile, but today there was no response. Maya's concern deepened as she knocked again, calling out his name softly. She could hear a faint shuffle from inside, and moments later, Mr. Collins slowly opened the door. "Hello, Maya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect you so soon." "Mr. Collins," Maya said, stepping inside with the muffins. "Are you okay? You don't look well." Mr. Collins smiled weakly, but it was clear that something was wrong. His face was pale, and his eyes lacked the usual spark. He seemed out of breath, and there was a slight tremor in his hands as he closed the door behind her. "I'm fine, Maya. Just a little under the weather," he said, but his voice didn't have the usual reassurance. Maya's mother had always told her to trust her instincts, and in that moment, her instincts told her that Mr. Collins wasn't okay. She helped him to the living room, and as she sat him down on the couch, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She could see how much he was trying to hold everything together, how he wanted to be strong, but it was clear that he needed help. "Maya," he said softly, his voice trembling just a little, "I've lived a long life, and I've been through a lot. But sometimes I think I might be too tired to keep going this way. I don't want to be a burden to anyone." Maya's heart broke for him. She had always admired Mr. Collins for his strength, for his quiet resilience, but hearing him say these words made her realize how deep his loneliness ran. He had spent so many years alone, trying to manage everything by himself. And now, as the years weighed heavily on him, it was hard for him to ask for help, even when he needed it most. "You're not a burden, Mr. Collins," Maya said softly, her voice full of empathy. "You're not alone. I'm here for you, and I always will be." He looked at her for a long moment, as if he was trying to decide whether or not to believe her. But there was something in her eyes, something warm and honest, that made him feel a flicker of hope. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to him. "I never thought I'd have someone care about me like this again," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet emotion. Maya smiled, gently placing her hand on his. "You don't have to ask for anything. I care about you, Mr. Collins. You've always been kind to me, and I'm just returning that kindness." The room was quiet for a few moments, the only sound being the crackling of the fire in the hearth. It was in that stillness that Maya realized how important these moments were. Sometimes, helping someone wasn't just about fixing things or providing assistance. It was about being present, offering a listening ear, and giving someone the chance to feel seen, heard, and cared for. After a while, Maya helped Mr. Collins to bed, making sure he was comfortable and settled. As she tucked him in, she promised to check in on him the next day. He thanked her, his voice quieter than usual, but his expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his eyes glistening. "You're a good girl." Maya smiled warmly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I'm just doing what's right. I'm here whenever you need me." As she left his house that night, Maya's thoughts were filled with both sadness and hope. She knew Mr. Collins was going through a difficult time, but she also knew that their bond was strong enough to carry them both through it. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it, to be there for him, just as he had always been there for her. And in the silence of the night, Maya realized that sometimes the best way to show love was not in grand gestures, but in the quiet acts of care and kindness that filled the gaps between words. The weeks that followed felt like a turning point for both Maya and Mr. Collins. Winter still had its grip on the neighborhood, but something inside Mr. Collins began to change. With each passing visit from Maya and her family, He seemed to find a new spark in life. It was as if the kindness they had shown him, the simple acts of caring, had lifted him in ways nothing else could. The burden of loneliness that had weighed so heavily on his heart for so long was beginning to ease, and with it, a sense of joy and peace returned to his life. Maya noticed the change in him during their visits. He started to smile more, and his stories were filled with a new energy. It wasn't just about the past anymore. He spoke about the present, about the things he looked forward to each day. He had once seemed like someone who was just passing through life, waiting for the end, but now he seemed to find meaning in the small moments, the ones that most people overlook. One afternoon, as Maya walked down the path to his house, she noticed something different. The front yard, which had once been overrun with weeds, was now neatly trimmed, and there were flowers blooming in the garden that Mr. Collins had once let go. She smiled to herself, knowing that the changes weren't just about the outside. They were a reflection of the inner transformation that was taking place. When she knocked on the door, Mr. Collins opened it with a wide smile. "Well, look who's here," he said, his voice full of warmth. "I've been waiting for you." Maya couldn't help but laugh. "I brought you some fresh cookies today. Thought you might enjoy them." As she handed him the box, she noticed that his posture seemed a little straighter, his steps more sure. It was the kind of change that was subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Collins wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. They sat together in his living room, sipping tea and chatting about everything from the weather to the neighborhood gossip. For the first time in a long while, Maya noticed how at ease Mr. Collins seemed. There was no sadness in his eyes, no trace of the loneliness that had once been so obvious. He was genuinely enjoying the moment, enjoying her company. "You know, Maya," Mr. Collins said thoughtfully as they talked, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me a while back, that I'm not a burden, that I'm not alone. I didn't really believe it at first, but now I can see that you were right. I've had more people care about me in the past few months than I've had in years." Maya smiled warmly. "I'm really glad, Mr. Collins. You deserve it." He looked at her, his eyes soft with gratitude. "You've been such a blessing to me, Maya. I never expected to find someone like you, a friend who's so kind and patient." Maya's heart swelled at his words. She had always believed in the power of kindness, in the idea that small acts of compassion could change the world. But hearing him say those words made her realize just how much they had already changed him. And, in a way, it had changed her too. Over the following months, Maya and her family continued to support Mr. Collins, but it wasn't just about the physical help anymore. They had formed a bond that went beyond simple assistance. Maya would visit often, sometimes bringing over books to read, or just sitting together in silence, enjoying each other's presence. They had become family, in the truest sense of the word. One spring afternoon, as the weather warmed and the flowers bloomed, Maya sat with Mr. Collins on his porch. He was telling her about his plans for the garden, about the new plants he wanted to grow. His excitement was contagious, and Maya could see that he had found a renewed sense of purpose in the world. "I might even start a little vegetable garden," Mr. Collins said, his eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. "Who knows? Maybe I'll have enough to share with the neighbors." Maya laughed. "I'm sure they'll love that." And as they sat together, talking about the future and the things they were looking forward to, Maya realized just how far they had both come. They had started as strangers, and now they were like family, bound by care, kindness, and love. Mr. Collins had found his way back to life, not through grand gestures or life-changing events, but through the quiet, everyday acts of love and friendship that Maya had shown him. And in doing so, he had reminded her of something important, that sometimes the simplest things in life could be the most powerful. Their story was one of unexpected friendship, but more than that, it was a story of healing, of two people coming together and finding strength in each other. It was a reminder that love doesn't always come in the form we expect, but when we open our hearts to others, we can find connection in the most surprising places. As the seasons change, so did the bond between Maya and Mr. Collins. Spring brought with it a sense of renewal, both for the world around them and for their friendship. The flowers in Mr. Collins' garden blossomed, their vibrant colors a reflection of the new energy that had entered his life. The once barren yard was now full of life, and the small vegetable garden he had started was already showing promise. Every time Maya visited, he would excitedly show her the new growth, his pride shining through with each new sprout. Maya, in turn, felt a deep sense of joy seeing Mr. Collins so animated, so full of life. It was a transformation she had never expected to witness when they first met. The elderly man, who had once seemed so isolated, was now looking forward to each new day, and that was in large part due to the friendship they had built together. Maya had never expected to form such a deep connection with someone so much older, but life had a funny way of bringing people together, teaching them lessons they never thought they'd learn. One Saturday afternoon, Maya decided to take a walk to Mr. Collins' house, her arms full of fresh ingredients from the local market. She was going to make him a hearty stew, something to share while they sat and talked about his garden and life. As she approached his porch, she noticed that the door was open. This was unusual. Mr. Collins was usually very private about his home. Curious, she knocked softly before stepping inside. "Mr. Collins," she called out, her voice light but tinged with concern. When she entered, she found him sitting by the window, looking out over the garden. His back was slightly hunched, and his hands were resting on his lap, but there was a peaceful look on his face. He didn't look sick, but he seemed lost in thought. Maya stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if she should interrupt his quiet contemplation, but then she gently walked over to him. "Mr. Collins, are you okay?" she asked, sitting down beside him. He turned to face her, a soft smile appearing on his face. "I'm more than okay, Maya. I was just thinking about everything. The garden, my life, and all that's happened in the past few months. I've never felt so alive." Maya sat quietly, her heart warming as she listened to him. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about his feelings, and it filled her with pride to know that she had played a role in helping him get to this point. "I never thought I'd find such a sense of peace, especially not at my age," Mr. Collins continued. "But you and your family, you've changed my life. You showed me that it's never too late to start again, to open my heart to others." Maya's eyes misted over at his words. She had always believed that kindness could change the world, but hearing it from him made it real. It wasn't about the grand gestures. It was the little things, the small acts of kindness, the time spent together, that had made the difference. It was in the quiet moments, the ones that most people would overlook, that their connection had truly blossomed. As they sat there together, talking about life, the garden, and all the things they still wanted to do, Maya realized just how much their friendship had taught her. She had learned that age, race, or background didn't matter when it came to building a meaningful connection. What mattered was the willingness to care, to listen, and to be there for one another, no matter the circumstances. Later that evening, as they sat down to enjoy the stew Maya had made, Mr. Collins looked at her and said, "You know, Maya, I'm no longer just waiting for the days to pass. I'm living them, and I owe so much of that to you." Maya smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "You've done all the hard work, Mr. Collins. I just helped you find it." As they ate and talked long into the evening, Maya realized that this was the kind of friendship that would last a lifetime. It wasn't about what they had given each other. It was about what they had found in each other: trust, love, and a shared appreciation for the small moments that made life beautiful. That night, as Maya headed back home, she couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed since meeting Mr. Collins. It had started as a simple act of kindness, but it had turned into something far greater, a true and lasting bond. The neighborhood might have been quiet, but within it, there was a story of compassion, of love that crossed generations, and of two people who had found a family in each other.